hopefully. It's not too far down. Okay. Okay, hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Nicky. Please call me that. I know it says Nicole, but I go by Nicky. And I'm, as Dominique said, an alumna of the Life Sciences Communication Department, and I finished my PhD this past summer. And my plan today is to present to you about my dissertation research, which is titled How Anti-Science Discourse Limits Research and Action on Science Polarization. So some of you already know me because I've been around the department. For those of you who don't, I'm a social scientist. I specialize in science communication, and my research interests are focused on misinformation, trust in science, and issues of social conflicts surrounding science, which sometimes involves polarization related to scientific issues. So my dissertation is kind of an intersection of all of those research interests, so you'll see me touch on pieces of those today. Before I start, I just want to say that the idea of polarization is a complicated concept. So it's come to my attention that people in the room are coming from very widely varied backgrounds and maybe not super familiar in some cases with science communication. So I'm going to try to tailor this as I go to that. But polarization is essentially this idea that there are subgroups of society who are divided in their attitudes or beliefs about something. So you could measure this in various ways in regard to science. So you could imagine, for example, that maybe political groups like Democrats and Republicans might be oppose each other in terms of their belief that scientists should participate publicly in policymaking. That's one way that people could be polarized over science. But often in recent conversations, and this is part of what I'm going to talk about, there has been a lot of interest in the idea of people being polarized in their factual beliefs about science. So the example I just gave isn't a fact. You know, reasonable people could disagree about the extent to which scientists are it should be involved in policymaking, but you may have be familiar with the idea that some social groups have been polarized in, for example, believing that climate change is human-caused, or agreeing that vaccines for COVID-19 are safe for adults. And so there's a lot of attention to that kind of division in science issue context at the moment. And some people refer to those kinds of factual belief polarization problems as science polarization, even though there are many kinds of science polarization we could study. So that's just one thing I want to say right off the bat. Okay, so my project, let's keep going. Okay, so maybe you have seen headlines like this, books like this. The reason I put these up here are to just kind of show you that there are increasing conversations about the idea that some subsets of the American population and in other countries around the world are anti-science in their attitudes or beliefs. You can see examples like these are just books that have come out recently talking about, okay, we have this rise of an anti-science movement. There are some social groups who are kind of opposing science and posing serious threats of various kinds to social life. So maybe inhibiting public health initiatives in the context of the pandemic, for example, or other kinds of problems. And there are also related claims being made. This example on the right, I think, is from 538, just an article that's saying, you know, that being anti-science has become a part of some of these groups' identities. So in this case, it's talking about rural Americans and saying, you know, some rural Americans have come to see themselves as anti-science. So I'm not going to go into huge detail about this label, anti-science, and kind of the debates that surround it, but I do want to point out that there is a lot of nuance that we could add to this conversation. So when someone is saying that rural Americans are anti-science, one way to think about this is that members of rural communities could actively be seeing themselves as opposed to science in some way. That if they self-describe that way, if they relate to each other and kind of feel a sense of group cohesion in terms of opposition to science, we might say, oh, they're anti-science. Another way of thinking about this is that maybe rural communities don't see themselves that way. Maybe they see themselves more specifically as anti-elite or anti-intellectual, but because of those trends, some of their attitudes and beliefs could have anti-science implications from the perspective of policymakers or researchers, for example. That you could say, oh, if you're anti-intellectual, then you might be less likely to support scientists' funding or pay raises or something like you know, research grants from the federal government. So I think this is an important distinction. It's very different from a psychological perspective for a group of people to actually understand themselves as anti-science versus holding beliefs that from the outside have anti-science implications. And so that's nuance to this conversation, but I just want to give you that, put that in your head for now as a part of this conversation about when we talk about people being anti-science and how it contributes to forms of polarization, how it can get very complicated because this label anti-science is kind of imprecise. We don't always know what people are talking about. Okay, so you may be familiar with this in your daily life. Maybe you've seen or read some of these things or just had conversations about the idea that anti-science groups are a problem of some kind, in part because of this factual belief polarization phenomenon. So there's some concern in research communities, policymaking communities, philanthropy, that the anti-science groups, kind of, as I said, ambiguously defined. It's unclear if these groups actually understand themselves as anti-science, but they're being referred to as such, are posing threats to, as I said, things like public health initiatives, for example, the uptake of vaccines. And in this conversation, this version of concern about polarization surrounding science, the problems that are emphasized often are things like some social groups seeming to reject scientific consensus on things like climate change. So sometimes this is referred to as science denial. We have concerns about some social groups exhibiting lower levels of trust in science as producers of knowledge about the world. So you can see how these are interrelated. If we have low trust, maybe that's why people are rejecting scientific facts. And then relatedly, the idea that if groups are not trusting scientists to make claims about the world, and they're not and they're rejecting some factual claims, then what do they believe? And so there's an increasing amount of interest in misinformation, conspiracy theories, and basically these alternative epistemologies. So I imagine that some of this is probably familiar to you, but what I want to remind you of is what I said at the beginning, that there are many kinds of polarization that we could look at in science issue contexts. There's a lot of research attention to this at the moment, and possibly for some good reason. Although, as I said, there's a lot of emphasis in particular on the idea that sort of anti-science groups and their ideologies are the kind of drivers of these divides in factual beliefs. Okay, so this is how I characterize this conversation. So people can disagree with me about this, and maybe you do, but I just want to add, I guess, that this is my take. Some people may have different takes. But one thing that I see in research in this space is that it puts forth a particular understanding of polarization problems. It focuses on studying particular social groups. And it is a way of kind of dividing up society and saying, well, there are the people who believe the facts and trust the science, and there are the people who don't. And it can seem kind of intuitively obvious, maybe, with that formulation, that we should probably focus our research attention and funding and things on studying the people who don't. Because how can it be sort of a problem that people believe the facts or trust the science? If we want to solve some of our problems, then we would need to invest in understanding anti-science groups and where their attitudes come from. So that is kind of how I see some of the conversations. This isn't all the literature, but it's a popular subset of research in this area. And the reason I'm going to give you one more background slide explaining this discourse, but the purpose of my dissertation is to kind of reflect on what some of the limitations of this thinking might be, which is why I'm setting it up for you this way. So one thing, I skipped a slide. It's okay. Let me actually go forward. Okay, so one thing I want to say before I explain what my concerns are is that as people have been trying to understand why is it that some of these anti-science groups form beliefs that are inconsistent with scientific consensus, or why do they exhibit low trust in science, one of the answers, and there are many proposed explanations, but one answer comes from social psychology, and it is rooted in social identity theory. And it says, essentially, keep it kind of simple, but that people have allegiances to particular social groups, that they're kind of, those are their teams, those are the ones they defend, and those are the ones that when issues come up in social life that sometimes can be complicated, it can be an easy shortcut to say, I'm going to just form the same beliefs as the other people like me. So if really prominent members of, for example, the political right are saying that climate change isn't human-caused, or that we should be skeptical of scientists, then the idea is that some members of that political group, same might happen for religious groups, for example, or other communities, that it would be like, well, I'll kind of stick with my team and form a similar view. So it's this kind of group-centric account of how people form their views instead of deliberating very carefully over all of the evidence. So hopefully that's making sense. And so there is some merit to that idea, this like social identity theory explanation, and there are reasons to study some of these anti-science groups if they are indeed anti-science. But my dissertation is commenting on the ways that we kind of limit ourselves needlessly with particular ways of thinking about polarization and with this emphasis on the anti-science side. So one of the concerns that I talk about is the idea that this research approach is very one-sided a lot of the time. So part of what I'm going to show you with social identity theory is that it is actually a theory of intergroup relations. So if people are going to use social identity theory to talk about this, and it is true that social identity theory would predict that somebody would, maybe see their other similar in-group members or their elites from a group they care about, and then kind of form their beliefs aligned with them. But the other thing social identity theory talks about is that, these identity categories we're a part of are kind of meaningless until we as a society give them meaning. So you say, well, what does it mean to be a Democrat? In part, it's because of what Democrat elites are saying it means. But it also means whatever Republicans are not doing. So in part, groups define what they care about, what they value, and their issue positions by comparing and contrasting themselves with other social groups, especially the ones that they see themselves as in conflict with. And so that becomes like a mutually influential process where these groups in social life are kind of reacting to each other quite a bit. And so some of the positions that people hold can be influenced by stuff that their opponents, quote unquote, or perceived opponents are doing. So if we study polarization surrounding science in this kind of one-sided way where we only ask what's going on with the so-called anti-science groups, we're probably missing a very important part of the story about why they're forming those beliefs, which may include reacting to things that the other side is doing. Hopefully that's making some sense. You'll see some of that as I show you kind of empirical examples in each of these areas. Okay, so the other concern I have is that this focus on the anti-science side, as valuable as aspects of it might be, kind of misses the idea that there could be things to be concerned about with really strong levels of support for science or science acceptance that might be driven by these same kinds of identity biases. So it can maybe seem like, well, if people are believing the facts, if they're trusting the science, that they do so for reasons we would want them to, perhaps. Like they're very strong critical thinkers, or maybe they just have very carefully deliberated over everything, looked at the evidence themselves. But realistically, social identity theory is a social psychological phenomenon that should be kind of universal in the human mind, and that people on the science support side of things may also be forming their views, in part just because they're conforming with their groups. So if they see other Democrats posting signs that say science is real, we support science, some share of high levels of vaccine acceptance, high trust in science, can also come from these kinds of conformity impulses. Which raises the question, do we really care? If these attitudes are going in the direction that we would want them to go, perhaps, is it really a problem that these are coming from something like this kind of shortcut group-based thinking? And I think there are multiple reasons to be concerned. One is that some of the pro-science kinds of attitudes that people have are then susceptible to social forces that we don't study or know very much about that could shift over time. So some of these maybe desirable attitudes end up being vulnerable in ways that we're not tracking and not paying attention to, because they're just linked to shifting social dynamics that could change. Another reason to be concerned is that the social identity theory says, yes, people who are strongly attached to their identities maybe be forming biased factual beliefs sometimes. And in this case, the pro-science groups, quote unquote, are not doing that, so who cares? But one other aspect of social identity theory is that people form not just biased factual beliefs, but biased social perceptions. So they can come to stereotype anti-science groups if they see them as threatening, can come to be intolerant of them in various ways, and as strong identity attachments develop, people can come to see their group, in this case, let's say a kind of pro-science group, as very morally righteous and moralizing their viewpoints, to the point of seeing the other side as kind of villainous, evil, and those problems can inhibit people's ability to cooperate and compromise. So there is research into this on the anti-science side. The idea that these strong identity attachments would maybe make people kind of hate scientists, would make them want to support punitive policies against them. But there's not as much research about how those same kinds of intolerance outcomes can happen on the pro-science side in ways that might restrict the rights of people to speak up with skepticism about science, for example. And so this is a two-sided concern that we would expect would inhibit our ability to have people productively deliberate about science, which we need them to do for things like AI and human gene editing, and make these decisions that are as inclusive as possible. So the last point is that if we consider polarization surrounding science in this kind of one-sided emphasis on like what's going on with the anti-science people, it's very difficult to see a middle. So once it's two-sided, then we can say, okay, we've got anti-science groups, quote unquote, people who are, skeptical or exhibiting low levels of support. We've got the kind of really high science acceptance maybe on pro-science. And then we have potentially a group of people in the middle who aren't participating in this. Kind of like in political contexts, there might be strong levels of bickering between Democrats and Republicans. And there are independents and moderates out there who also have unique communication needs, who may be frustrated with this kind of bickering and opting out of political participation. So the question is the same thing happening in science contexts? The more we talk about this idea that there's conflict between anti and pro, are we potentially pushing away a bunch of people who don't really want to participate in science discussions if they're just going to be fraught with bickering? So hopefully that's making sense. My dissertation raises these as concerns. Okay, so the rest of the time, I'm just going to touch a little bit on the empirical evidence that my dissertation presents, so the data I actually collected to try to highlight why these things can be problematic. Again, it's kind of introducing each of these, and so there's not an exceptionally deep exploration into any of them, but it's trying to highlight the idea that we could use more research in some of these areas, and why. So the first one is what I was saying about this one-sided analysis of kind of the anti-science forces, quote unquote, that would drive polarization of a particular kind, and the ways in which that's only a partial application of what social identity theory is saying. So it's kind of missing that other layer I mentioned about intergroup relations and paying attention to how what other groups are up to could influence what this group is thinking. So now this is the part where, depending on the extent of your familiarity with stats, I'm going to try to keep this pretty simple, but the idea is, in my dissertation, I was collecting data from a survey and asking people about their levels of vaccine acceptance. So this is a way of asking people, measuring basically whether they believe vaccines are safe, whether they think they effectively prevent disease. And so it's a common outcome of interest in some of this research, especially given the pandemic, where we're like, we really don't want people to have low levels of vaccine acceptance because that can contribute to some of the poor vaccine uptake that we've seen. And so this is commonly studied lately in just research in this area. And the question is kind of like, researchers will say, well, what would we expect in terms of group identities, in terms of the ideologies those groups adopt, that would detract from vaccine acceptance? And we should put that into a regression model and say, oh, I skipped this, just a second. So we put that into a regression model. And you don't have to understand this regression table, but I will tell you that what happens is we'll say, maybe it has something to do with their age. Maybe as their age goes up, they're more or less likely to accept vaccines. Or maybe it has something to do with various other demographic factors that we can put in this model. But we do expect that it would have something to do with partisanship, given the political controversies in the pandemic. So I think often how partisanship is measured is something where it's like you have a scale from 1 strong Democrat all the way up to 7 of strong Republican. And the idea is that you say, as people become more and more Republican, as they go up in this scale, we see vaccine acceptance go down. So the odds of having high vaccine acceptance, if it was just 1, that would be no effect. If it's less than 1, then it means that the odds are going down. If it's above 1, the odds are going up. And so you can see, okay, it looks like in this formulation, the more Republican you get, the less you accept vaccines. The more evangelical, if you're evangelical versus not, in this case it's not a scale, it's just a dummy, then you're less likely to accept vaccines. And we'll put ideologies like conspiracism and anti-intellectualism in there and kind of see how do these things chip away at these groups' acceptance of vaccines. So what my dissertation is saying is, like, if you're going to use social identity theory to say that people are committed to their group identities in the context of group conflict, and that's what's causing the anti-science groups to defend their views and not accept vaccines, then you should be modeling the other contrasting groups as well, and measuring the effect against a different, more neutral group like independents. Or in the case of religious beliefs, we have evangelical and fundamentalist Christians who may be rejecting vaccines, but perhaps they're in conflict with a very strong non-religious group that is exhibiting really high acceptance of vaccines. So this model is kind of noisy about the intergroup processes because it doesn't show it. So I modeled the same exact data over here with this approach, and you can see that Republican is still negative effect here. The more, if you're a stronger Republican, your vaccine acceptance goes down, but not as much. Now that we've taken the Democrats out of the other side of that scale, the negative effect of being Republican is not as exaggerated as it was, because there's a strong positive effect of being a Democrat. So hopefully that's making some sense. So my dissertation is saying that some previous studies, there's a lot of noise, and then the interpretation of results can kind of be exaggerated in a way that makes it look like there are these really strong negative effects of these anti-science factors, which there probably is some effect, but it's just unclear how much noise there is and how exaggerated the effect might be in some cases. Okay, so that's one thing, clearer depiction of intergroup processes on this side. And one of the things I want to point out before I move to the next slide is just this deference to science factor that's in the model on the right. So you can see deference to science is a way of measuring this belief that science is a superior epistemology. It's like a superior way of producing knowledge about the world. And that as a consequence, we should defer to scientists' expertise in decision making. So people who are answering questions related to that on a survey are saying things like, scientists know best what is good for the public. Strongly agree, like let the scientists decide kind of thing. And I put that in the model because, instead of just modeling the other side, the anti-intellectualism, for example, or conspiracism, this endorsement of epistemological positions that maybe oppose science by some arguments, we should also be modeling this like belief in the epistemological superiority of science. And you can see it has a strong positive effect on vaccine acceptance. So I was also curious, I'll show you in a minute, about the share of people who exhibit strong deference to science. I think I put it in here anyway. We'll see. Okay. So the other aspect of this that I mentioned at the beginning, a kind of criticism of this literature, is that there's not as much attention to what happens if support for science goes too far, is driven by these kinds of strong identity attachments, and might contribute to kind of some forms of social perception bias or intolerance of anti-science groups or people who even express skepticism of science. And there's not a lot of research into this, so for this dissertation, I fielded some survey questions asking people about something I was referring to as moralized science support, which is this idea that this is just one example of this set of questions, but it's saying it is immoral to be skeptical of claims that are backed by scientific consensus. Not just it's impractical or irrational, but that it is like actively wrong to be skeptical of these things. Similarly, in this set of questions, I asked about whether it is immoral to not trust scientists. So, you choose to trust people or you don't. There's many different reasons someone might trust someone, but do you agree that it's immoral to not trust them? So this is what this battery of questions was measuring. And I also asked people about whether they would support censorship for anti-science kinds of speech or speech that is contradicting scientific facts. Censorship, in this sense, is saying, like, should we consider this a free speech exception? This is, people can say what they want, but they shouldn't be able to speak in ways that contradict scientific facts. Who agrees with that kind of question? And then the last thing is some of the literature and kind of social identity theory would suggest that you would, support your in-group members, or people that you feel are your allies, like scientists in this case, being active in political life and advocating for the interests of your group and your value system. And so I'd expect that people who can have this kind of in-group affinity with scientists would support scientists being active as scientists in political life. And so my expectations were that Democrats would exhibit some of these more pro-science attitudes for a variety of reasons. In just like social, cultural life, political life, the actions of some of the Democratic elites. And there's a reason to expect this of Democrats, and I can explain that if we want in the questions. But so these were the results. There was some support for my expectations. I'm just showing the coefficients from my regression analyses for that expectation, not the whole model, but it was similar to the other model that I showed. I thought the same would be true for liberals, which is not exactly the same thing as partisanship, political ideology, but so this pattern looked like this. So there's some support for that in my data. And I expected that for conservatives, it would be the opposite on all of these, that they would not agree with these things. And that was true. So what I want to point out here is that there's some is kind of an exploratory study here because it's not typically measured, but there's some emerging evidence, I think, that there are some of these social perception kind of biases and possible forms of intolerance developing on the pro-science side of this polarization discussion, in addition to all of the work that is showing that there are probably also some of these things happening on the anti-science side, like that we do see some emerging dislike of members of the scientific community among groups who are conspiracy theorists, for example. But yes, my point is we should also be paying attention to this on the other side of the equation, because if we want both of these groups, all of these groups, to be able to participate productively in conversations about science, this is going to be difficult, it's going to make that difficult. If, for example, some people feel that it is immoral to even be skeptical, that will make this quite a challenge. Okay. Yeah, so this is the slide I mentioned. When I say like we need people to be participating in good faith, I guess, willing to listen to each other, not seeing the other side as evil in some of these conversations about science, it's probable that the most likely people to show up to those things are going to be the people who are highly politically involved. So I also asked in this survey about people's levels of political involvement. How active are you? There's a particular way of measuring that, and if people are curious, I can talk about it. But and then I split apart the data set to say, among the people who are highly involved, and based on their politics, how deferent to science are they? And what you can see is this, that among highly involved liberals, and the graph for Democrats looks the same, there are a high share of those people, the black bar, who have high levels of deference to science. Where, as you can see, for the politically active conservatives, what's not shown here, it doesn't add up to 100%, is because it's not showing moderate levels of deference to science. So that's a missing bar. But for conservatives, for example, it's basically a third, a third, a third. They're split in how deference to science they are. But among the political left, it's more uniformly the case that you have this kind of strong pro-science ideology showing up, which I think is interesting, because this idea that the political right is cohering in its anti-science ideas is actually not as supported here by this. Otherwise, we would expect to see really low deference to science as a huge share of that group. Is that making sense? Okay, so it seems like there's more coherent pro-science kind of support on the left than there is anti-science on the right in this example, by these measures, just to be clear. Okay. The last thing I'm going to say, and then we can go to questions, is that about the group that's kind of in the middle, or the people who don't necessarily want to participate in any of this anti-science, pro-science. This is going to be an experiment that I conducted with some of the other colleagues in LSC. So we were curious, basically, if people are expecting to participate in a conversation about a topic that's controversial, something like human gene editing. If you said, hey, join this online discussion of human gene editing, and what might drive them away? And one of the things that we thought was like, well, if we said that, hey, you're about to participate, which we did. We had an experiment where we invited people as an online experiment. We said, you're going to participate in this discussion. We just described it in different ways. And one of the things we thought was that, well, sometimes people can be turned away from a discussion of controversial science because it's going to just like turn their worldview upside down, basically. They're like, oh man, we're going to talk about human gene editing. It's going to make me question everything I know about right and wrong. Like, should we do this? Should we not? And it's like, I don't want to do that. It's going to be messy in my brain. And that's this cognitive discomfort threat. So some people might not like that, and they might be like, no. But other people might not want to participate simply because they might expect that it will be full of social gridlock and everyone's just going to bicker. And it's not so much that I care that my worldview is going to be messed up. It's more that I just don't want to be around all of this fighting. And so we were like, which one of those things turns people away more? And so we did this experiment just to see what threatens people, so to speak. And the way we measured whether they were turned away, we did a variety of things because we thought, I don't know, there could be different outcomes that might be affected by this. One is that they might just be less willing to speak up about their opinion if they think the discussion's going to go one way or the other. They might also just say they won't join, so they just don't come. Another one is that they might just have, I don't show it here, but negative expectations. So they do join, but when they join, they're kind of in a bad mood about it. They're just like, I think this is going to be unproductive. I think it's going to be boring. You know, they might just have negative expectations. And so the basics are, we told people you're going to participate in a discussion. We described it as like it's going to rock your worldview or it's going to be full of bickering. And then we asked these kinds of questions, and we wanted to see what happens. So this is this going to rock your worldview kind of condition. And it turned out that people didn't really find that threatening. They didn't want that. They were okay with it. In fact, sometimes they were more willing to say they would speak up. And by contrast, though, expecting there to be a bunch of social conflict in the discussion did turn people away in ways. It made them less or more likely to expect that the discussion would be negative by various measures. And they particularly disliked it, because there was one other way that we described this, particularly disliked it when we said, people will be in there questioning what they think they know, but they will barely be able to hear themselves think, basically, because of all of this fighting around them. That seems to make people the most annoyed. And we did expect that, you know, people's reactions to these would depend on who they are. People who are really high in dogmatism don't like having their worldview messed up. So we thought, okay, that one will turn away people who are really high in dogmatism, or people who are really conflict avoidant aren't going to like the other one, obviously. And so we did look at how some aspects of people's personalities could influence these outcomes. And I'll just give you a couple examples, and this is the only one I'm going to give, really. But there were some differences based on people's personalities. So in this example, it's like the blue is people low in dogmatism. They became more likely to say they would express themselves when we told them people are going to be grappling with what they think they know. They're going to be questioning their beliefs. Because we think it's probably kind of inviting to hear that people are going to be open-minded in the discussion. So that pulls in. Whereas the people in red, doesn't matter what you say, the people who are higher in dogmatism are just going to join. And they're going to speak up, or they're fine with it. Versus the one on the right here, there's also, like, you can see perceptions that the discussion will be productive. I think it was productive, yeah. So people who are low in conflict dominance in blue, now versus just telling them the discussion is going to be about human gene editing, the moment we say there's going to be all this bickering and you're not even going to be able to hear yourself think, then they're like, no, I'm not. This discussion is not going to be productive at all, and they're primed with these really negative expectations. Whereas the people higher in conflict dominance, the red, that's flat. They don't really care. So what this says to me is that, you know, when we talk so much about conflict between social groups, when we're talking about science issues, we're really creating this kind of expectation that science issues are full of this kind of bickering, which potentially is turning away people who are low in dogmatism, people who are low in conflict dominance. And these are the kinds of people we really need to participate in some of these deliberations about science. So in addition to all the things I said about how some of the ways we study this can be misapplications of theory or kind of incomplete, we also are possibly creating expectations that are reducing the in diversity and inclusiveness of some of these conversations based on personality type. Okay, so this is the last slide, which is basically just summarizing some of the things that I said about implications for research and action on polarization related to science. My recommendation for researchers, if any of you are science communication researchers or interested in it, one of the things is just to not view support for science as the default kind of desirable view that we then just measure and in our statistical models set up as like, oh, let's just look at all the things that chip away from that. We should be kind of studying this more fully with this kind of two-sided view where that recognizes that support for science can also be driven by biases, can be potentially problematic when it reaches really high levels or becomes really attached to people's identities, and we should watch out for those things. This is the second point. How high do we really want some of these things to go? What is the actual goal? We have a lot of campaigns promoting trust in science. What would success look like? Do we want 100%, like nobody to wonder or be slightly skeptical? That would be concerning given some of the history we have seen. Scientists aren't always right. There was eugenics there were things that we should be grateful that people at different points in the past have been skeptical of what scientists have to say. So something to consider. And then the last thing is what I was just saying, that conflict rhetoric in political context has been pushing away independents and moderates demonstrably from participating in civic life. Are we replicating that same problem to some extent in science issue context, sort of needlessly, by talking so much about anti-science groups being threats and how we should try to save science, and as if it's this war basically between groups, because we might see the same kind of effect, and that would be detrimental to our ability to have these conversations that the national academies are saying we need to have about all of these issues, gene editing, AI, et cetera, where they're saying we will only be able to productively move forward with extensive, diverse public input. So we need as many different types of people as possible, including some of those science skeptics, to participate. And we need to be able to do it in good faith. So that's my presentation. It's 36 minutes, and this is me.
Thank you for a great presentation, Nikki. I will let you lead the discussion.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And we can stop the recording at this point.